Well, good evening. We are now live on Facebook and we have folks joining us in Zoom as well. We are absolutely delighted to welcome historian and author Ann Gass tonight. I'm Desti Homan-Sprague. I'm the executive director of the Maine Women's Lobby. And part of our work is really to make sure that we're highlighting and uplifting where we've been as a movement for gender equity and women's rights. So that we have all of the tools and resources to think about how we can best move forward. And Ann Gass is just such an exciting and important notable here in Maine. She's the author of several books, not only We Demand, which we'll be talking about tonight, but also Voting Down the Rose and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage. She is an activist and historian. She represents Maine women on the Maine's Permanent Commission on the Status of Women, as well as being active on the Maine Suffrage Centennial Collaborative and is the coordinator for the National Votes for Women Trail. So we are thrilled to welcome Ann here tonight. She'll be talking with us for a bit, and we're also happy to have your questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat if you're here on Zoom with us, or you can put them in the chat on Facebook, and we'll be sure to keep our eyes peeled over there and get those questions over to Ann as well. So, hello, Ann, welcome. Good evening. We're so happy to have you.
All right. Thanks very much for organizing this, Desti and Dania. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I'm going to talk. This is kind of a little bit of a different talk for me because I'm going to talk about my new book, my novel, We Demand, the Suffrage Road Trip. But I'm also going to just kind of leap forward in time and pick up the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, because in my view, in my experience, those things are very connected in my mind. And I like to, it's a great opportunity to connect them for others as well. So I'm going to go ahead without any further ado and just share my screen. So, because I have a bunch of historic or slides, some of which are historic photos. So this We Demand is a novel of it's a historical fiction novel that it's about this epic cross-country road trip for suffrage that took place in 1915. It wasn't the first ever cross-country road trip, nor was it the first one ever undertaken for women, but it was the first one, as far as I know, to be undertaken for a cause, and that cause was voting rights for women, or women's suffrage. And just a quick shout out to my daughter, Emma Levitt, who did the illustrations for the cover, as well as for the chapters. So, you know, just a quick backstory of what this is about. That in 1915, it's sort of late September, 4 women leave San Francisco at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and their mission is to drive all the way to DC carrying this monster petition. This is a clip from a headline from that time, signed by 500,000 women. They're going to demand that Congress pass an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women. So that's the sort of quick summary. It's worth pondering that in 1915, the U.S. Constitution explicitly recognized only men's voting rights. And at that time, it was 67 years from the Seneca Falls Convention, which is, you know, often sort of characterized as the first organized, or the start of women's organized fight for voting rights and other equal rights. It's been 126 years since the Constitution was adopted. Those are long stretches, and women have been fighting off and on for rights all this time. They've made some progress. We'll see a little bit more, but it's still a really long time. And they didn't know in 1915, is it going to be another year before we get the right to vote? Is it going to be 5 years or 10 or maybe another 20? You know, who knows? They didn't know. And so a lot of their, a lot of the pressure on getting this amendment passed was just because of this long time frame that they've been working on it. Up until roughly 1912, 1913, the fight for suffrage was almost exclusively on winning it state by state. And here's an example of a suffrage map where the white states are the good states. They're the ones that have enfranchised women through some sort of state action. And here you can see that not just the states, but what year it was that they enfranchised women. The sort of shaded states are the ones where there's some aspect of suffrage allowed to women, but not full suffrage. And the black states haven't made any progress at all. And so in 1912, 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns start this Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage with the sole focus on winning an amendment to the US Constitution enfranchising women. There have been, by this time, over 500 state campaigns for full voting rights, for presidential voting rights, for municipal voting rights, some combination thereof. And it's been, such a long time, as I said, and not a great return on investment for all that time and money invested. I mean, to only have a dozen states or so enfranchise women. So Alice Paul is young, she's new to the movement, or she's, a young leader in the movement, I should say. And she comes up with a strategy that she's kind of adapted from what the suffragettes in England were doing, which is to punish the political party in power for failing to move the federal suffrage amendment through Congress, because they had it bottled up in some committee or other, and or it didn't even refer to committee, so it couldn't be brought to the floor for a vote. And in 1915, this was the Democrats. Woodrow Wilson was president. He was a Democrat, and the Democrats had majorities in both houses of Congress. So this is an illustration from 1915 of the strategy that they're going to use. And again, I mean, it's sort of an interesting symbolism here. Again, the white states are the good states. They're the equal suffrage states. In the black are the Eastern women who are in the kind of black pit of despair because they don't have the right to vote. And a couple other things to note about this is that this modern woman voter, is young, she's white, that's not an accident. She looks like a goddess. I mean, wouldn't you want her on your side voting? I mean, she looks like she'd be a great contributor. So this is really what they're trying to do around this time is kind of focus attention on these white, younger women, educated, affluent, often from affluent households. That's kind of like their poster child in a way for voting rights. She's not black. They're definitely trying to steer attention away from the fact that if they enfranchise all women, then black women would also be enfranchised. Although they, in a very chilling way, they're pretty overt about telling the suffrage states, look, we're just telling you that you can't prohibit voting on the basis of sex, but anything else is up to you. So they're basically saying to the southern states, Jim Crow laws, go for it. It's up to you to decide. So that's kind of chilling. But I mean, this trip is a threat really to the Democrats, and because in 1916, Woodrow Wilson will be running for re-election. There's something like 4 million women voters now who've been enfranchised through state action. And if they can be persuaded to vote as a bloc, they could determine the outcome of the presidential election and maybe even some of the congressional races. Could they do it? Nobody knew. That had never been done before. So, but that's what this trip is all about. So they started the Panama Pacific International Exposition. The Congressional Union is the only suffrage organization at the Panama Pacific, and it's a really clever move on their part, because a World's Fair, of course, is that's where all the modern the scientific inventions are showcased, and artists and new social work kinds of things. Their booth was right next door to a booth that sold voting machines, so people could go next door and practice voting if they'd never done that before. There were, the Ford Model T they had a little plant there. Model Ts were rolling off the line. So, they're positioning themselves as we're part of the future of this country and the world. And here's their booth at the Panama Pacific. And here's where they collect those 500,000 signatures on that petition. And during the, then they start planning this women voters convention that they're going to have in mid-September. They bill it as the first ever in the history of the world convention of women voters. And the idea is that they're going to unite women behind this strategy of the federal amendment, and they're going to launch these envoys eastward to DC to bring the petitions to Congress and the president. It's a great idea, and all through the winter and spring, they're talking about it in the Suffragist. This happens to be a front cover from their weekly newspaper, the Suffragist. And they're talking about all these plans, and at one point they're saying, we're going to have 100 cars go east to Washington. It's going to be amazing. And the reason why petitions were so important was because there are no polls in 1915, and the petitions are one way, or signatures on a petition are one way that women could indicate to Congress and to other male voters that they really did want the vote. So, they're going to, and they need to raise awareness. This cause is not widely, known or cared about, really, especially in those Western states that have been enfranchised for a number of years. So they have to kind of wake up the country to let them know that this is an issue. And if no one can miss, 100 cars, all driven by women and sort of occupied by carrying other women to DC. And it's a great idea. Everybody loves it. The problem is no one volunteers to go. And they're coming into mid-August, mid to late August, they still don't have anybody to go. And then into the booth one day wander these two middle-aged Swedish immigrants, and they say, well, we took a boat out here, a ship to from our home in Providence, planning to buy a car and drive back to Providence, kind of having a vacation along the way. And we'll take the petitions. Providence isn't that far from DC, and it's not a big deal. It isn't really clear that they understood what they were offering to do. It certainly, I think they had in mind that they were going to have a vacation. That was their plan, but it didn't end up turning out that way, because anytime you got involved with the Congressional Union and Alice Paul, you were going to work your fingers to the bone. And that's this trip ends up being this mad, unrelenting dash from coast to coast. So let me just introduce some of the characters. This is Inkyborgenstedt, and she's 50 years old at the time of this trip. She was the mechanician, or what we would call now a mechanic. She changed a dozen tires on the trip east and fixed a lot of what went wrong under the hood, brakes, whatever. And she was a radical. She was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a radical labor union then. And she was also self-employed. She did background checks on Swedish immigrants who needed recommendations or references in order to get work in factories and as domestic help. She lived with Maria Ginberg, who was 55 years old at the time of this trip. Maria actually bought the car and did almost all the driving. Ingeborg was kind of the backup driver, and they hired a man to drive them a couple times, but the second time he got them lost in the desert at night, so they never hired another man after that. So Maria's 55. She's been a midwife her whole career, delivered 2,000 babies or so, and she's not really the activist that Ingeborg is. She was a little bit more retiring. She was much more maternal. This is how she was, they each were described by Alice Paul and some other people who were involved with this trip. But she's very game and incredibly tenacious when she needs to be. Sarah Bard Field ends up being the sort of envoy. The Congressional Union decided that only women who actually lived in an equal suffrage state could be the envoys. It's possible that's true, but it's also likely that they didn't want the Swedes, who are kind of frumpy and they speak English with a funny accent and don't look like that modern woman voter. They didn't really want them showcased as you know, the envoys. So Sarah is like 34 years old or so at the time of this trip. She's kind of a hot mess. She lives in San Francisco, has been divorced for a couple of years. Her husband also lives in San Francisco, and he is, she's a poet and has been a suffrage activist. The Congressional Union has and the other suffrage organization have employed her before. She's a good speaker on the stump, and they know that she can handle the travel because she's traveled in other other suffrage campaigns. But the way that she was a hot mess was she was in love with a man who was 30 years older than her, Charles Erskine Scott Wood, and he lived in Portland, Oregon with his wife and family. And Sarah experiences their separation as a kind of death. I mean, she's misses him. She's so sad that they can't be together. She's not sure they ever will be. And so she's kind of mooning after him. And then she also has some health issues. She had malaria in the summer before they left. And she has some sort of undiagnosed heart ailment that, especially at higher elevations, causes her a lot of problems. So she needs a lot of coddling along the way. She also doesn't know how to drive. Frances Jolif is the other envoy. She's a San Francisco socialite, had worked hard for Wilson in the 1912 campaign, and that's kind of why they wanted her on this trip. They thought that she would do some fundraising for them, and that Wilson couldn't turn her down if she showed up in Washington looking for an audience. Unfortunately, Frances makes it to Sacramento, their first stop, and then she quits, and she doesn't rejoin them until Albany, New York. And they never know when she's going to return, and so they keep pretending that she's on the trip, which is kind of weird. And so she gets a lot of attention and notoriety even when she's been gone for weeks, and sometimes the Swedes aren't even mentioned at all. So Mabel Vernon was the advance organizer, and she set up these events, and she kind of traveled ahead of them by train and set up events in the towns and cities that she went through, and set up opportunities for them to speak to the congressional delegations in the states that they went through, because Congress isn't in session. Their goal is to show up in DC on December 6th, which is Congress's opening day. And so, you know, again, remember what I said about, you know, they're trying to pull people together and unite women, especially behind this strategy of the constitutional amendment. And so everything they're doing on this trip is calculated to you know, and organized toward that one goal. The car is kind of another character in the book. I have Ingeborg and Maria christen her Amelia Rautu, she was a Swedish suffragist. So she was an Overland 6 created by the Willis Overland Company out of Dayton, Ohio. It cost about $550. They bought her brand new. And she was a pretty good little car, but you can see that she's missing one key item, which is a roof. She does have, she's kind of a convertible, and so that they can pull up the roof from the back and fasten it down, but it tends to kind of trap the fumes, so they run with it down as much as they can. And they're going to go, this is their route, they're going to be leaving San Francisco. It's hot in mid-September, especially, you know, especially during the day. It cools down at night in the desert, but they're going to be going up into the high plains of the West at higher elevations. It's going to be a lot colder, especially at night. And then they're following the route of this Lincoln Highway, which was a very aspirational term for this highway in 1915. It had only been conceived of for a few years before. The darker line is the line of the Lincoln Highway, and the red line is where they depart from it. So you can see by November, they're going to be, at Thanksgiving, they're going to be in New York City. And then they're going to come down the East Coast to DC. it's going to be cold. This car doesn't have air conditioning. It doesn't have heat. And like I said, it doesn't have much of a roof. So they have to be tough, and they were. So they leave San Francisco. They lose Francis Jolif in Sacramento, and they make their way across the Great Basin of Eastern Nevada to Salt Lake City, and have a big event on the steps of the Capitol there. And you can see this is a pretty typical photo of what their trip would have looked like. They're wearing purple, white, and gold banners, which are the colors of the, or sashes rather, that are the colors of the Congressional Union. And they would bring in local suffragists, who, especially any that were like the heroes of their own suffrage movements, and as well as, as I said, members of Congress, or in this case, the governor was at this event, as was the mayor of Salt Lake City, and 2 or 3 members of Congress. So they had a good reception there. And then they kept going. They had quite an kind of a horrible experience traveling from over a pass from Laramie, Wyoming to Cheyenne, where they were supposed to meet the governor. There was a blizzard, and they were the only car to make it over the pass that day. So I talk about that in the book. And they hit mud. This isn't their car, but it's a photograph from that era, really. And you can just imagine it's raining hard. They decide to take a shortcut. The road isn't as good, and they get stuck in the mud at 10 o'clock at night in this, traveling through these cornfields in Kansas. And it's quite a struggle to get out of there. Sarah ends up having to walk back anywhere from 1 to 3 miles, depending on which account you read, and wake up a farmer, get him to hitch up his mules and come tow them out of this bog that they've sunk into, and then they can continue on their way. So, do they make it to DC on the appointed day and time? Do they meet with the president and Congress? You'll have to read the book to find out. But this is an example of the extraordinary measures that women had to undertake in order to win voting rights. There were other cross-country road trips that happened after this, and there were all kinds of marathon efforts to persuade congressmen to vote their way, and all kinds of shenanigans that they, had to try to pull to try and get some attention and some influence. So I learned about this trip in the course of writing my first book, which was about my great-grandmother. And she's actually here in this picture. It's a little bit hard to see, and I have an arrow on her, but she's standing behind this rightmost sign that says, "Why does Wilson seek votes from women when he opposes votes for women?" She's actually in Chicago. She lived in Maine. She was a Mainer, but Alice Paul had hired her to go out to Wyoming in 1916 to campaign against Wilson, to try to persuade Wyoming women to vote against him in that 1916 election. This happens to be in Chicago, and she had stopped for this protest there. And this was just minutes before they're attacked by a mob who wrenches the signs they wrench the signs from these women's hands and end up chasing them back to suffrage headquarters. It was quite, made the national news, or it was in, front page news and newspapers across the country. But in this case, I kept reading about this trip, and I kept thinking that it must have been one hell of a trip in 1915. But the accounts of it that I read were always just, a couple paragraphs or maybe a page or so, not a lot of detail. And that was why in 2015, 100 years later, I decided to retrace their route. And I stopped where they stopped, and met with women's rights activists and leagues of women voters and others to try to understand what difference having had the vote meant to women in the preceding 100 years. And I did a lot of other background research on the 1915 trip as well, and stopped at libraries and museums and historical societies to see if I could dig up some more local coverage of what happened. I wasn't really able to do that. And I also, during this process, realized that all of the attention was on Sarah Bard Field and Frances Jolif, and these two amazing Swedish immigrants really got short shrift, not only at the time, but in later historical accounts. And that's partly because all of what we know, or most of what we know about this trip, what comes from Sarah Bard Field, who was writing letters almost daily, these voluminous letters to her lover, and to tell him what was, where they were and what was happening. So he, she didn't like Ingeborg, so she painted her in very unflattering terms, and every historian since then has done the same. So I decided to write from her perspective, and I ended up having to fictionalize it because I just couldn't find out much information about them. But writing as a novel also helped me to bring in some other historical figures like Joe Hill in the labor movement. He was a fellow Swedish immigrant, and he was also a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, wrote these songs that poked fun at the high and mighty and the rich and wealthy, and he was beloved by workers all over the world. But he was in Sugar House Prison in Salt Lake City when they came through in 1915. And so I have Ingeborg meet with him, although there's no record that she actually did. They also weren't meeting with Black women or any women of color on the way across the country. So Ida B. Wells Barnett was a famous journalist. She was the leading anti-lynching activist in the country. Had, co-founder, I think, of the NAACP, had done a huge amount of work on suffrage as well. When they stop in Chicago, where she lives, she's not invited to the events. She's not on the platforms with them, but I have them go and visit her at their house, and they sort of talk about the race issue, which is, a big part of the background of the suffrage movement at this time and throughout, really. I think I'm just going to show you these pictures, and these are from the actual trip. You can see, I love this picture there. Here they are in Brooklyn, New York. And you can just see this hat is not the sort of hat that, affluent middle-class women would wear when they're, trying to be out in public. So that, in Ingeborg's case, that's, it almost looks like a pussy hat. It's kind of funny. Here's a photo of them meeting some muckety-muck, some politician somewhere. And here, I think they're in Denver or Chicago here. One of the few photos where you see Ingeborg smiling. So that's their trip, and they have a lot of adventures. I can't possibly describe them to you all, but I really wrote the book to be a tribute to the Swedes, as well as to the other women who made the trip, and to the grit and determination of the suffrage movement that launched it. It's a great story, and I did as much as I used the original trip as my training wheels, and wove in other, fiction to kind of knit the story together when I needed to, and to highlight other historical events. And here they are, the fabulous four, all together at the end of the trip. So this is the language of the 19th Amendment. If you're not familiar with it. Took 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention to get this into our Constitution. No other body or group of people in this country had to fight this hard just for the right to vote. And of course, it wasn't the end of the story. It was really just the end of the beginning, because there were all kinds of other rights that women didn't have and wanted to get. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. I love this quote from Alice Paul. I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most problems are complicated, but to me, there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. And we're still working on that, right? Because the Equal Rights Amendment is still not ratified, or not ratified and passed, I should say. So really, this is what it's about. Equal justice under law is one of the the foundational beliefs of this country, but women really aren't included in that, not in our country and not in our state. And the United States is the only developed nation with a constitution that doesn't explicitly protect the rights of women. Somewhat ironically, in other countries where the US has, been involved with wars with them and has been involved in rewriting their constitutions after wars, like Japan and Germany and even Iraq, they wrote women into the Constitution in ways that they aren't in our own. The pioneers were Crystal Eastman, Alice Paul, and Bernita Matthews. These are three of the women who worked together to craft the original language, and they got it introduced to Congress in 1923. And this is some of the rationale, which is like, hello, women should have full equality with men. Labor laws should protect men and women equally. It's a very feminist perspective. When women shouldn't be excluded from good schools and good jobs, and they should have equal rights to their children and authority over their children with men. But not everybody believed in that. And here are some examples of other opponents. Each of these actually has ties to Maine. Florence Kelley had a summer place in Naskeeg, and Frances Perkins had a house up here as well. I think her dad was from Maine. And Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, they had Campobello Island, but they didn't believe in the Equal Rights Amendment. They thought it was a terrible idea because they had worked hard over the decades to enact special laws to protect women from exploitation, especially in the workplace. And they insisted that because women were mothers, they had to have special protections, like only working a 50 or 54-hour week and not being allowed to work all night. And they were kind of like, well, men can take care of themselves. And I mean, their concerns were somewhat justified because after the 19th Amendment was ratified, the US Supreme Court ruled that women, they have equality now, so those special protections aren't needed. And women's wages really took a nosedive. And so, perhaps their concerns were justified, at least in the short term. And it takes a while to start building support, but they go about it in much the same way that they did in building support for suffrage. And by the 40s, the NAACP has embraced it. There are planks for the ERA in both major party platforms, and other countries are embracing equality post-World War II. And Mary Church Terrell is one of the Black leaders who promoted the ERA. But again, the anti-ERA folks are not giving up, but they shift their focus away from labor protections and toward arguments like the ERA would end alimony or end requirements that men support their wives, or the National League of Women Voters was very concerned about widows' pensions and that women wouldn't be able to get widows' pensions if the ERA passed. So they keep working on it. In the 50s, they're starting to make some progress. It passes the ERA with a 2/3 vote in 1950 and 1953. But this guy, Representative Seller, who was the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, opposes the ERA and prevents a vote on the House floor for 10 years, for more than 10 years. It just gets, this is how they use procedural votes to bottle up legislation they don't want to get passed. So finally, in 1960s, Martha Griffiths, who was a state U.S. rep from Michigan, gathers the petitions that she needs on a discharge petition to force it onto the floor for a vote. It takes her a long time, but in August of 1970, she demands the floor debate. And she's helped by these, these are just two of the supporters. I really want to recognize Shirley Chisholm from New York. She was the first African-American woman to run for president, just a huge figure then, and really amazing person, and Representative Patsy Mink as well from Hawaii. Both of them came on board and were staunch supporters of the ERA. Margaret Chase Smith in Maine says it's high time that we stop thinking of women as being second-class citizens. She wasn't, she didn't go out of her way for the most part, to position herself as a women's rights activist. She was very concerned with the armed forces and trying to not be labeled as concerned just about women's rights, but she was a big supporter. So it finally gets through Congress in 1972, but then of course it's got to go out to the states for ratification. And this is Phyllis Schlafly who starts this Stop ERA, and the stop means stop taking our privileges. That's an acronym for that. And she leads, is one of the leaders of the efforts to stop the ratification. And so Congress has only given the women 7 years to get it ratified. So by 1979, they're still not done. They're 3 states short. They go back to Congress and ask for a three-year extension. But the country's moving to the right. I mean, Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980, and they just can't get those last 3 states. Phyllis Schlafly was one of those. She famously told a Bates College audience during her second visit to Maine that there was no such thing as marital rape. She said, by getting married, the woman has consented to sex, and I don't think you can call it rape, but marital or spousal rape is now illegal in all states. So you can see that she, was pretty out of step with the American opinion. Her daughter is now following in her footsteps and came to Maine to campaign against the Maine ERA in 2019. So Maine ratified in 1974. They tried it in 1973 and it lost by 1 vote in the legislature. But the Maine branch of the National Organization for Women organized and got it done in 1974. And I didn't know Lois was going to be on this call, but I did want to give her credit for all her tireless work on equal rights for women in many, many different fields. So thanks, Lois, and I really appreciate all your work. So here we are with the national ERA. This is the map. The pink are the states that ratified. The blue are those that didn't. Looks an awful lot like the sort of voting map these days. The 3 in kind of gold are ones that ratified. Nevada ratified in 2017, Illinois in 2018, and Virginia in 2020. And so now it's in front of Congress, and it's a little unclear what's going to happen next or how they're going to navigate it. But there's a bill in the U.S. House to basically eliminate the time that 10-year time limit that they were imposed, that was imposed on this. So the alternative is to start over, and who thinks that we could get this done and ratified even through Congress, let alone ratified by 38 states if we did a do-over. So the better option is to just simply remove the expiration date, and that's what they're working on now. I was really struck by some of these arguments for why women should get the vote, should get the ERA, and why we should eliminate that time, time restraint. That women were not equally represented in Congress. They still aren't. And the original deadline of 7 years was a political maneuver whose intent was really designed to thwart ratification. And that the male legislators, just like they did in Congress, did it in a lot of states using procedural tricks. So there were some sort of dirty tricks played along the way, and it just isn't fair to hold women to that standard, especially when there's other amendments that haven't been. But Maine is one of the states that also does not have ERA-like language in its own state constitution. This is a photo from 1984. Libby Mitchell, who was the House floor leader at that time, and Representative Diamond and Martin promoted it in the Maine legislature. And it's been introduced into the legislature ever since. But in 2019 was the last time they voted on it, I think, and every Democrat voted for it, every Republican voted against it. It was never in Congress when it passed back in 1972. It was never a partisan issue. It got overwhelming support. I mean, in the high 80s or 90s, 90 of all of Congress voted in favor of it in 1972. But in more recent years, it's become very, very partisan. But I mean, I believe, and others do as well, that as a matter of principle and permanence, our founding documents should treat men and women equally under the law. And it's not the case now. Sex discrimination continues. Yes, women have made huge strides, but there are still issues around pay equity, of course, gender and pregnancy discrimination in the workplace, sexual violence, and fair access to medical care. Those are just some examples. So your vote counts. You can do this. You can help with this effort. In 2020, we commemorated the suffrage centennial and Maine's bicentennial. The legislature should pass the Maine ERA and just let the voters decide, because in Maine, of course, that would be the steps that would have to take place. It would have to pass both houses of the state house and by a 2/3 margin, and then go out to the voters for ratification. So here's how you can help. Join and support the Maine Women's Lobby, of course. And encourage, write to the congressional delegation to support removing the ERA time limit. I believe all 4 of our members are on board, but it's good to keep them there. Equal Rights Maine is an entity in Maine that has been trying to organize support for especially the Maine Equal Rights Amendment. But the National ERA is, you can support them through the equalrightsamendment.org. And there's this really cool young people's organization for the National ERA called Generation Ratify, all, high schoolers and college students, and they're promoting the National ERA. So that's my contact information, but I think I'm going to stop here, and we can go and see if folks have any questions or comments they want to share.
Wonderful, Anne. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and I learned a lot. I'm happy to open the floor to questions from the folks in the room. And Representative Brackett, I would absolutely love to entertain your questions and comments, because you've really been on the front lines of this work for so long. So you have the floor.
I have to try to tear myself away from the campaigns in 1973 and 74, of which I was a part. So it was very frustrating to lose by 1 vote, which I always blamed on the senator from my district who voted against it. But so did Olympia Snow when she was in the legislature here. So it was. So I sometimes get stuck there, but. Basically, what's happening right now in Maine is that I had filed the Equal Rights Amendment, 5 years ago now, and we lost. 3 years ago, we almost won. We lost by 2 votes in the middle of the night. But again, I had 3 Republican co-sponsors. They all bailed, and that was basically what happened. And we, as you said, Anne, no Republican votes at all. And it was very frustrating. And because the Democrats lost seats in the 130th, which is the one that's going on now, I introduced it again, but I asked for it to be held over to this year because I knew we couldn't win it last year at all. And the hope is that this year we're gonna have the hearing early in the session in the hopes to cause a kerfluffle and perhaps get people to pay attention to it when we go into primary seasons and the election campaigns, so that people can ask the question, what are you going to do when the question is, we're faced with the question in the House and Senate, are you going to vote for equality for women? The Senate did pass it by sufficient margin, by the way, the last time out. It was the House that we came up short by 2 votes. So anyway, the point is that's we're going to do that, but I have to tell you, optimism is not the high end of my thought process on it. But I looked to the state of Virginia, where what happened there and the ratification of the federal is that the women really rose and campaigned and felt like an old suffrage campaign again. And they really organized and worked in order to change the faces that were in the state legislature. And that really is what we have to do, because if we don't recruit another, I think this time, because of the losses last time, I think we need to have a margin that was broader than we did before. So it would be, we'd have to about 8 seats, I think, in order to make it work. So that'd be wonderful. I'm not the world's most optimistic about it right this minute, but I'm going to give it the old college try, because it's just, I can't, I've had this mantra for years that I didn't want to be the Susan B. Anthony of Maine, because Susan B. Anthony, of course, died before women got suffrage in the federal efforts, even though she worked her life at it. So I've been working on this since 1971, and it's now 2021, and I believe that's 50 years, if I'm not mistaken. Could be 60, I'm not sure. But in any case, it's way plenty of time, and I would really love to live long enough to see this pass in Maine, but we'll see. But I urge people to, I'm hoping that we'll end up with a sort of a hybrid hearing process in Maine. And if we do, and the Equal Rights Amendment has a hearing, I hope that we get hundreds of people asking to testify, because it's very easy when we're in this remote model to testify. And I think, frankly, it gives people a better opportunity than if they had to drive 5 hours from Presque Isle to get to Augusta. So we'll see what happens. So we're at it again, and it got carried over, and it's the only bill that I introduced last time that got carried over. Actually, miraculously, all but one of the others I did passed, which is, I never believed that would happen. And so we're really, it's really my total focus this upcoming session. So let's hope it goes.
Well, it's certainly very high on our priority list. So I'm really hopeful that we can work with you and perhaps the Permanent Commission on the Status of Women and some of the other groups that are dedicated to this in Maine, because it's completely unacceptable that it's been turned into a partisan issue. I loved that quote from Margaret Chase Smith, like, it's not a partisan issue. It's not controversial. Equal rights are what we should all expect as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah, never mind. Go ahead. Are there other questions? Oh, I just was going to mention, I neglected to do this at the start, but in the chat, there are links to where you can buy either of my books from Maine Authors Publishing directly, or you can go to your local bookstore and they can order it for you, or it's also on Amazon. And also in the chat is my website where you can learn more about me and the books and also order them. So sorry for that quick commercial. Other questions?
Glad that you did draw attention to that. Any other questions or comments from folks in the room or over on Facebook? I just checked, and we've got an active crew over there watching. But so folks on Facebook, if you have any questions or comments, we're happy to bring them over into this thread. And do you have any sort of parting wisdom for us as we move into yet another fight for equal rights in this next session that you learned through your research for this book that you think we can bring into the effort?
Well, I mean, it can be useful to empower people through fear, I guess. And one of the things I think people should be aware of, women especially should be aware of, is that the right to vote is the only constitutionally protected right that we have. Every other right that women have won has come through some sort of legal decision or legislation or executive order, those kinds of things. And those can be undone pretty quickly. I mean, we saw in his first week in office, President Trump signed an executive order, expanding the gag rule, the global gag rule that prevents organizations from even talking to women about abortions. Not just, I mean, it's not shutting down their ability to provide abortions. They can't even refer them to other abortion providers. And more recently we've seen Texas take steps to essentially eliminate women's access to abortion. So we should be nervous. We can go backwards. It's not case that the moral arc of the universe, bends towards justice. Perhaps it needs a lot of people hanging on it sometimes to bend it down, and it can go flinging backwards and catapult us all off and in the wrong direction. So I think that it's important to remember that, and we have to be vigilant and make sure that your kids or your grandkids or your neighbors and your in-laws or whoever just knows about this history, because we're not taught it in school, and it still is the case. I've been in Maine classrooms where there are no famous women on the walls of the classroom. It's unbelievable to me, but women are still kind of written out of history, and so we who know this history have to keep talking about it and making sure other people know.
Great. Well, I couldn't agree more. I think especially, in work at a feminist organization, by the way, co-founded by Representative Reckitt, who's joined us here tonight. So thank you for your work then. Thank you for your work now. I think sometimes there's a feeling that like, oh, haven't we done that already? And we just absolutely have not. There's still so much more to do. And I found that your comment about only voting being constitutionally protected, like that's really inspiring and motivating for me. And I think that that's the energy we need to bring into the next session and our continued work for equity.
Yeah, and I would just say too, for me, I'm late to the party. I didn't start even learning about this history till I was in my 40s as a result, and starting to research my great grandmother. So again, I'm just enormously grateful to all these women who've carried this fight on for all these years. But I find, if speaking in public or speaking out isn't your preferred way of life, it's helpful sometimes to think about all those women and all the hands on this issue that have been on this issue all these years. And whenever I get myself into a position where people are challenging me or being nasty, I just think about Alice Paul or my great grandmother or these women on this trip and realize women are so tough, and we can be tough on this and we can see it through.
All right. Any last comments from the folks in the room? Okay. Well, thank you for that. I feel inspired, and I am excited to continue learning about this and to continue our work for gender equity at all levels, starting tonight, but really as we move into the next session, because we have a lot of work to do on the ERA, as we mentioned, and a range of other issues next session: paid family and medical leave, making sure period products are available in middle and elementary school and high schools. We have work to do on maternal health. So quite a laundry list of protections and bills that I think will really make the lives, improve the lives of women and girls in Maine. So thank you, Anne. Thanks to our audience, and hope to see you out on the front lines and in our email inbox. Feel free to reach out to us. We're at mainewomen.org, and we look forward to working with all of you. So,
thanks for your work, Dusty, and it's just we'd be lost without you.
Well, I'm happy to be able to be here. So thank you.